In 2019, something happened that should have changed everything. Scientists proved how to cut cattle emissions by 80%, completely. But instead of celebrating, the mainstream went silent. No headlines, no policy push, nothing. Because if people knew this worked, the entire narrative falls apart. And we're about to show you exactly what they've been hiding. The story begins in a laboratory at UC Davis, where a team of researchers stumbled onto something remarkable. They discovered that a simple red seaweed called asparagopsis, when added to cattle feed, could reduce methane emissions by an astounding 82%. Not 8%, not 18%, 82%. The finding was published in peer-reviewed journals, backed by rigorous data, and should have been front-page news across every environmental publication on the planet. It wasn't. Instead, it disappeared into the academic void while the narrative about cattle destroying the planet continued unchecked. This wasn't an accident. This was strategic. Think about what 82% reduction actually means. A dairy cow produces between 250 to 500 liters of methane per day through enteric fermentation, the natural digestive process in ruminants. Cut that by 82%, and you're reducing daily emissions by roughly 200 to 400 liters. Scale that across the global cattle population of approximately 1.5 billion animals, and the emission reductions become staggering. But the seaweed story never became the dominant narrative. Instead, the conversation remained fixated on elimination, on reduction of herd sizes, on fundamental transformation of agricultural systems. When you have a solution that eliminates most of the problem, but that solution gets ignored while the narrative pushes for system-wide restructuring, it tells you something important about what the agenda actually is. For years now, you've been told that cattle are killing the climate. Every environmental organization, every mainstream media outlet, every climate conference has hammered this message home. Cattle produce methane. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Therefore, cattle must go. The logic feels airtight. The problem feels obvious. The solution seems clear. Reduce cattle. Eliminate dairy. Transform agriculture. But when you actually look at the data, when you trace back to the source of these claims, when you examine what's being said versus what's being ignored, something doesn't add up. And the reason it doesn't add up is because the entire narrative has been constructed not to solve a problem, but to justify a predetermined conclusion. The narrative has been engineered to hide something far more complicated than a simple environmental problem. It's hiding an agenda that goes to the core of global food systems, agricultural control, and the concentration of power over what billions of people eat. Let's start with the basic numbers, because numbers don't lie, even though people who present them certainly do. According to the most recent data from the Climate Trace database in 2024, cattle enteric fermentation accounts for approximately 3.66% of global greenhouse gas emissions. 3.66%. A dairy cow produces somewhere between 250 to 500 liters of methane per day through the natural process of digestion. A beef cow produces 200 to 400 liters. These numbers sound devastating when you hear them in isolation, which is exactly why they're always presented in isolation. Sound bites without context, percentages without comparison. These are the tools of narrative control. But here's what happens when you add context. The United States Environmental Protection Agency reports that cattle produce roughly 104 million metric tons of methane globally each year. That's real. That's significant. But now compare it to everything else. The energy sector, which includes oil extraction, coal mining, natural gas production, electricity generation, and fossil fuel-based transportation, is responsible for 76.2% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. 76, not 6, not 16, 76%. Agriculture contributes only 11.9% of total global emissions. Yet when climate change is discussed at international forums, when policy is debated in legislative chambers, when future agendas are set by environmental organizations, the conversation keeps circling back to livestock, to cattle, to your meat and dairy consumption. The energy sector that produces 3/4 of emissions remains largely unchallenged. The agricultural sector that produces less than 12% gets treated like an existential threat. This isn't proportional. This isn't logical. This is narrative control, plain and simple. When the complete supply chain is included, when you factor in feed production, land use change, processing, and transportation, livestock accounts for approximately 14.5% of global emissions. That's the number you see everywhere. It's the headline in every environmental publication. It's the statistic that justifies every policy proposal. It's the figure that's cited to prove that livestock is a major problem. But even this number requires context that is almost never provided. Cattle provide roughly 40% of all terrestrial animal protein consumed on the planet. 40%. That means from every animal source, chicken, pork, fish, dairy, eggs, cattle deliver 4 out of every 10 grams of animal protein eaten by human beings. And yet, the emissions attributed to cattle production, when you include all these downstream factors, is 14.5%. Let that sink in. 40% of the protein, 14.5% of the emissions from producing it. Compare that to poultry and eggs, which provide approximately 30% of animal protein, but contribute much less to global emissions relative to their protein output. The mathematics here are revealing. This means that cattle are actually feeding the world more efficiently than the narrative suggests. Cattle deliver more protein per unit of emissions than the dominant message would have you believe. But efficiency doesn't sell apocalypse. Fear does. Apocalypse requires eliminating options, not improving them. The energy sector produces 76% of emissions. Oil extraction, coal mining, natural gas production, electricity generation from fossil fuels, transportation powered by petroleum products. These industries have had decades to transition away from carbon-intensive practices, and yet they've largely resisted. They've lobbied governments to weaken regulations. They've funded campaigns to spread doubt about climate science. They've protected their market share and profit margins while the planet warms and atmospheric carbon accumulates. And somehow, despite this, the blame has shifted. Somehow, the primary focus of environmental activism has become not the industry that literally powers civilization and is responsible for 3/4 of all emissions, but rather the agricultural practices that feed 8 billion people. The focus of climate policy has become not the fossil fuel industry, but cattle farmers. The focus of climate rhetoric has become not energy consumption, but meat consumption. This redirection of blame is not coincidental. It's not natural. It's not the result of objective analysis of where the actual problems are. It's been engineered. It's been designed. It's been implemented strategically. In 2019, when that seaweed research was published, showing an 82% reduction in methane emissions, the response from major environmental organizations was muted. No massive push to implement the technology. No urgent calls for farmers to adopt the solution. No policy initiatives to make seaweed-based additives accessible and affordable. Instead, the conversation continued on exactly the same trajectory it had been following. Cattle bad, meat consumption bad, livestock elimination necessary. The most obvious and proven solution to the stated problem was simply ignored. This silence is the most revealing part of the entire story. Because if the goal was genuinely to reduce methane emissions from cattle, the logical response would have been immediate implementation of proven technologies. Seaweed additives, probiotics that reduce methane by 10 to 34%. 3-No-P, a compound that reduces methane by 20 to 70% in cattle. Improved breeding practices that select for low methane producing animals. Enhanced nutrition and feed efficiency. Management systems that optimize productivity. These aren't theoretical solutions. They're proven, scalable, implementable right now. A single dairy cow can produce between 250 to 500 liters of methane daily. Add seaweed-based additives and you cut that by 80%. The math works. The science works. The implementation could happen immediately, but it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because emissions reduction was never the actual goal. The real agenda is far more complex. It's about control of food systems. It's about control of land. It's about control of supply chains. And it's about obscuring a fundamental contradiction at the heart of global development policy. Climate goals and food security goals are in direct conflict, and nobody wants to admit it. In 2022, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations both recommended reducing global cattle herds as a climate mitigation measure. A major report from The Lancet suggested a 50% reduction in red meat consumption by 2050. These aren't fringe voices. These are the institutional authorities on both climate and agriculture. And they're calling for the elimination of a food source that provides 40% of terrestrial animal protein. The reasoning is sound from a pure emissions perspective. Fewer cattle means fewer methane emissions, but this reasoning exists in a vacuum that ignores everything else. The World Health Organization has established nutritional requirements that include specific intake of animal source foods. Vitamin B12, vitamin D, riboflavin, iron, calcium, and zinc are most bioavailable and most efficiently obtained from animal products. In low-income countries, where malnutrition is still a serious problem, where stunting in children is still common, where anemia affects millions, reducing access to animal protein doesn't solve climate change. It creates famine. It creates nutritional collapse. It violates the very sustainable development goals that climate policy claims to support. SDG 2 is zero hunger. SDG 1 is poverty reduction. Both explicitly depend on the continued availability of affordable animal protein. 50% reduction in meat by 2050 isn't a climate policy. It's a policy that would create humanitarian crisis in the developing world while doing relatively little to address the actual source of global emissions. Consider India. India has the world's largest cattle population. but Indians consume almost no beef. Cattle live longer, spend more time producing methane, and the entire supply chain is less efficient than Western cattle production. A beef cow in the United States reaches market in roughly 2 to 3 years. The same cow in India might live 10 years or more. The emissions per kilogram of meat are drastically higher. If the goal was actually to reduce global emissions, the policy prescription would be to encourage India to consume more beef, to accelerate cattle through the production system, to increase efficiency. Instead, the narrative promotes vegetarianism, reduced meat consumption, and celebration of India's low beef consumption as environmentally virtuous. This makes no sense from an emissions standpoint, but from a narrative standpoint, it's perfect. It allows the global north to blame the global south for having cattle while ignoring the fact that inefficient cattle systems produce more emissions per unit of output than efficient ones. The U.S. livestock sector has achieved dramatic efficiency gains. In the 1970s, 140 million head of cattle were required to meet meat demand. Today, just 90 million cattle produce more meat. The animals are bred for better feed conversion. They're fed optimized diets. They reach market faster. They produce more output per unit of input. These gains in productivity have directly reduced the emissions intensity of beef production. A pound of beef today requires fewer emissions to produce than it did 50 years ago. This is one of the great unmentioned success stories in climate-adjacent agriculture. But it doesn't fit the narrative of cattle as environmental villains, so it's never discussed. Instead, we hear about how many cows exist, not about how much more efficiently they produce. When researchers actually measure direct emissions, the numbers become even more revealing. UC Davis researchers have found that cows and other ruminants account for just 4% of all greenhouse gases produced in the United States. Beef cattle specifically account for 2% of direct emissions. 2%? If the United States eliminated every single cow tomorrow, if it shut down the entire beef and dairy industry, it would reduce total U.S. emissions by 2%. Meanwhile, the energy sector continues to emit at 76% of total levels, and the conversation remains focused on cattle. This is not evidence-based policy. This is narrative warfare. The metrics used to calculate livestock emissions also deserve scrutiny. Traditional global warming potential calculations measure how much heat a greenhouse gas traps compared to CO2 over a 100-year period. Methane is calculated as 28 to 29 times more potent than CO2 on this scale. But methane doesn't persist in the atmosphere the way CO2 does. CO2 accumulates. Methane breaks down within 12 years. This means that livestock emissions, which are cyclical and tied to animal populations that fluctuate, behave fundamentally differently from fossil fuel emissions, which accumulate irreversibly. A climate metric called GWP star attempts to seaweed additive reduces emissions by 80%. We already have a solution that's 250 times more powerful than what would be needed to stabilize livestock warming. This technology exists, it works, and it's been suppressed. Alternative climate metrics like GWP star have been scrutinized by climate scientists and deemed insufficiently conservative for policymaking. The IPCC cautions that GWP star creates complications in decision-making and raises equity concerns. Some argue that if a country with little cattle production suddenly increases cattle production, the warming impact under GWP star modeling could be larger than a country that's had steady large-scale production and methane emissions for decades, as long as the long-term emissions are stable or declining. This creates perverse incentives. This makes the metric problematic for policy. And this is exactly why traditional GWP calculations remain the standard in climate policy, even though they're acknowledged to be less precise at measuring actual warming. The policy apparatus has chosen an imperfect metric that produces larger livestock emissions numbers over a more precise metric that produces smaller numbers. This choice is not scientifically motivated, it's politically motivated. The climate establishment has settled on a specific narrative about livestock. That narrative requires livestock to be the problem. It requires emissions to appear as large as possible. It requires the solution to be dietary transformation, not technological innovation. And it requires this narrative to persist even in the face of evidence that contradicts it. Because if seaweed additives can reduce emissions by 80%, if probiotics work, if breeding practices and feed optimization work, then the entire argument for eliminating livestock falls apart. And if livestock is eliminated, control of global food supply becomes centralized. Land use transforms. Agricultural systems restructure. And those who control the new systems gain unprecedented leverage over human survival. This isn't speculation. This is openly discussed in international policy circles. The global agenda for sustainable livestock is a multi-stakeholder partnership involving over 100 institutional partners across 7 stakeholder clusters. It coordinates policy on livestock at the international level, and the official positions of this body explicitly state that policies focusing solely on Greenhouse gas emissions may benefit certain producers, but can harm broader sustainability goals. They acknowledge that climate-effective livestock policies must advance sustainable livestock production with multiple co-benefits across climate, biodiversity, environmental integrity, jobs, and community livelihoods. This is the official position. Sustainability must be holistic, but the global narrative presented to the public remains singular, focused, and apocalyptic. Cattle are the problem. Cattle must go. Meanwhile, in developing countries, livestock remains a critical poverty reduction tool. A family with a few cattle has insurance, they have assets, they have productive capacity. When drought comes, they can sell cattle. When illness strikes, cattle provide nutrition. When economic opportunity emerges, cattle represent capital that can be invested. For hundreds of millions of people in Africa, South Asia, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, livestock isn't an environmental luxury, it's survival. Policies that reduce cattle herd sizes in these regions don't reduce global emissions significantly, but they do destabilize livelihoods, reduce nutritional intake, and undermine poverty reduction progress. This trade-off is never mentioned in climate discourse. The conversation about livestock reduction happens in wealthy nations, in international forums dominated by wealthy nations, discussing solutions that primarily affect poor nations. This is not coincidental. The research on methane mitigation shows that there's a path forward that doesn't require dietary transformation or herd reduction. Feed additives work. Asparagopsis. Seaweed supplements can be delivered through pellets or lick blocks. They're accessible to grazing cattle, not just feedlot animals. The UC Davis research published in December 2024 specifically tested seaweed supplements on grazing beef cattle and achieved 37.7% methane reduction without affecting animal performance. This method can scale. This method works in real-world conditions. This method can be implemented immediately, but it's barely discussed. It's not part of the official climate agenda. Why? Because emissions reduction through technology allows the status quo to continue. It allows cattle production to persist in familiar forms. It allows developing countries to maintain existing livestock systems. It allows small farmers to remain competitive. It allows the current agricultural structure to remain largely intact. This isn't acceptable to the climate establishment that controls international policy. What that establishment actually wants is transformation. It wants to fundamentally reshape how and where food is produced globally. It wants to replace traditional livestock production with alternative proteins and controlled production systems. It wants to concentrate food production in the hands of large corporations that can control new food systems and distribution networks. It wants land to be rewilded or used for carbon offsets rather than supporting small-scale agriculture and rural livelihoods. And it wants all of this to happen under the guise of climate necessity, as if there were no alternative. The rhetoric supports this agenda perfectly. If cattle are uniquely evil, uniquely destructive, then the solution isn't incremental improvement, it's elimination. Elimination justifies complete restructuring. Elimination justifies land consolidation. Elimination justifies the entrance of new players, new technologies, new corporate structures into the food system. A world with fewer cattle is a world where farmers have less autonomy, less productive capacity, less ability to feed themselves without relying on supply chains. A world with fewer cattle is a world where land concentration increases, where corporate control increases, where the possibility of food system disruption and leverage over populations increases. The climate narrative is the mechanism through which this restructuring gets sold as necessary, righteous, and inevitable. The buried truth is this: we already know how to reduce cattle methane emissions significantly. We have multiple proven methods. The seaweed additive alone reduces emissions by 80%. Other additives reduce them by 30 to 70%. Breeding practices reduce them further. Feed optimization, grazing management, and health protocols all contribute. A comprehensive approach, using multiple technologies, could reduce cattle methane emissions by 95% or more. This would essentially eliminate cattle's contribution to climate change entirely. But this solution requires maintaining cattle production. It requires making incremental improvements to existing systems. It requires supporting farmers and livestock producers. And it doesn't allow for the complete restructuring of agriculture that certain interests desire. Instead, the narrative remains focused on elimination, on dietary transformation, on the need for fundamental change, on the impossibility of sustainable cattle production, on the necessity of moving beyond animal agriculture. This narrative is maintained despite evidence that contradicts it, despite technology that offers alternatives, despite policy positions that acknowledge the contradictions. The seaweed research from 2019 should have changed everything. It should have reframed the entire conversation about cattle and climate. But it didn't, because changing the conversation would have revealed the truth. The truth is that we don't have a cattle emissions problem that can't be solved. We have a control problem. We have an agenda to restructure global food systems. And we have a narrative that's being maintained to justify that restructuring. Look at what's happening at the policy level. The narrative about cattle is used to justify regulations that small farmers can't comply with. It's used to justify subsidies for alternative proteins, while traditional livestock gets squeezed. It's used to justify carbon taxes and methane regulations that make small-scale production uneconomical. So it's used to drive consolidation, where only massive industrial operations can afford the compliance costs and new technologies. 40 years ago, America had millions of family farms producing cattle. Today, the beef industry is dominated by a handful of massive corporations. This didn't happen because cattle production became inherently unsustainable. It happened because policy and narrative were aligned to favor consolidation and eliminate competition. The cattle narrative is the latest iteration of this mechanism. In India, where cattle are sacred for religious reasons, where cattle populations are massive, where efficiency is lower than Western systems, the narrative focuses on India's environmental irresponsibility. But India consumes almost no beef. The cattle are primarily dairy animals and draft animals. They have multiple purposes beyond meat production. A cattle reduction policy in India would devastate rural livelihoods and have almost no measurable impact on global emissions. Yet the pressure remains. The narrative remains. The solution being pushed remains herd reduction, despite being completely inappropriate for the Indian context. This reveals what the agenda actually is. It's not about emissions. If it were about emissions, the prescription for India would be completely different. The prescription would be to increase efficiency, adopt new feeding practices, implement technology. But instead, the message is always reduction. Because the real goal is structural transformation, not emissions reduction. The Lancet report calling for 50% reduction in meat by 2050 deserves scrutiny. It was positioned as a health and environment document, but the prescription for reduced meat consumption came with implicit assumptions about who would bear the cost. Reducing meat consumption in wealthy nations might improve certain health outcomes. It would definitely appeal to environmental narratives, but reducing meat availability in poor nations doesn't improve health. It creates malnutrition. It violates nutritional science. It violates the Sustainable Development Goals on food security and poverty reduction. Yet this prescription is applied universally. The same 50% reduction that might have marginal health benefits in an overfed population gets prescribed to populations that are undernourished. This is not science-based policy. This is ideology imposed through the appearance of science, and this is where the agenda reveals itself most clearly. When policy is applied universally regardless of context, when solutions ignore proven alternatives, when narratives persist despite contradicting evidence, you're not looking at genuine problem solving. You're looking at an agenda being executed. The cattle narrative serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It provides an emotional focal point for environmental concern. It justifies policy interventions that concentrate agricultural control. It provides a mechanism for regulating small producers out of existence. It redirects blame away from the actual largest sources of emissions. And it positions dietary transformation and food system restructuring as necessary and inevitable. The 2019 seaweed research proved that major emissions reductions are possible without eliminating cattle. More recent research has expanded the toolkit. But the institutions that control climate narrative have chosen not to emphasize this research. They've chosen not to make seaweed additives a priority. They've chosen not to align policy with the most effective solutions. Instead, they've continued pushing the narrative that requires elimination. This silence is intentional. This suppression is strategic. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The narrative about cattle destroying the planet isn't false. Cattle do produce emissions. But the narrative is incomplete in exactly the ways that serve a specific agenda. And the solutions that would address emissions without serving that agenda are buried in academic journals while the public continues to be told that meat must be eliminated and agriculture must transform. The real climate solution for livestock is simple and straightforward. Implement the technology that works. Make seaweed additives accessible to farmers globally. Fund research on expanded applications and delivery systems. Train farmers on improved practices for herd management and nutrition. Support producers through the transition to lower emission systems. Maintain productive agriculture while reducing environmental impact. This is achievable right now. This is scalable within existing infrastructure. This would actually address the stated problem of livestock emissions without requiring fundamental transformation of food systems. But it won't happen because the problem is the vehicle, not the destination. The stated problem of emissions isn't actually the goal being pursued. The real destination is restructured food systems, concentrated control over global agriculture, and transformed food production chains. Cattle are just the mechanism through which this restructuring gets sold to the public as necessary and righteous. And the seaweed research, the study that proved there's an easy technological way out, is the secret they can't allow the world to know. Because knowledge that the problem has a simple solution would require the world to question why elimination remains the proposed agenda. It would expose the true nature of what's actually being planned.